In the last years of the 19th century, when the map of Africa was being carved apart by foreign hands, one empire still stood unconquered in the highlands of the Horn of Africa. Ethiopia was old, proud, and difficult to reach. Its mountains rose like walls. Its plateaus stretched under a hard sun. Its armies marched through passes that outsiders barely understood. But to the European powers racing across the continent, Ethiopia looked like unfinished business. Italy wanted an empire. Britain had one. France had one. Belgium had taken one with unspeakable brutality. Even small European states dreamed in colors on maps, in ports, railways, mines, and flags planted over people who had never asked for them. Italy was late to the imperial feast, and latecomers often arrive hungry. Across the Red Sea, Italian officials looked toward Ethiopia and imagined a colonial prize that would prove their young kingdom belonged among the great powers. They already held Eritrea on the coast. From there, they pushed inland, mixing diplomacy with ambition, signatures with threats. In 1889, after the death of Emperor Johannes IV, Menelik II of Shewa rose as Emperor of Ethiopia. Menelik was no naive mountain king. He understood rifles, trade, spies, rivals, and the language of treaties. He knew Europe wanted Africa divided, and he knew Ethiopia would survive only if it learned how to move through that dangerous world without kneeling inside it. Italy believed it had found its opening in the Treaty of Wuchale. The Italian version claimed Ethiopia had accepted Italian protection, making the empire a protectorate in all but name. The Amharic version said something very different. Ethiopia could use Italy for foreign relations if it chose. One word, one phrase, one deliberate mistranslation turned diplomacy into a trap. Italy announced to Europe that Ethiopia was under its influence. Menelik rejected the claim. He had not inherited an ancient throne to become a puppet. He had not united rival nobles, negotiated weapons, and strengthened his rule so that a foreign government could speak for his empire. When the deception became impossible to ignore, the treaty became a fuse. The Italians expected division. They expected Menelik's regional lords to hesitate, quarrel, or betray him. They expected an African army to break before European discipline. They expected old assumptions to do part of the fighting for them. They were wrong. Menelik called the empire to war. From Tigray, Amhara, Oromo lands, Shewa, and beyond, armies began to move. Nobles came with their retainers. Warriors came with rifles, spears, swords, and shields. Women marched with the columns, carrying supplies, preparing food, tending the wounded, and sometimes fighting beside the men. Empress Taytu Betul, Menelik's formidable wife, was not decoration at court. She was a strategist, a political force, and a commander whose will hardened the Ethiopian camp. The roads filled with people. Tens of thousands crossed mountains and dry plains. This was not a scattered tribal rising. It was a national mobilization before the modern word had fully settled on the continent. Ethiopia was gathering itself like a storm. Italy sent General Oreste Baratieri, an experienced colonial commander, to finish the matter. His army was smaller, but it carried European confidence like armor. Italian officers believed speed and discipline would compensate for numbers. They had artillery, rifles, train formations, and the arrogance of men who thought history itself was advancing behind them. But Baratieri was trapped between caution and pressure. Rome wanted victory, newspapers wanted glory, politicians wanted proof that Italy could conquer like the older empires. Every delay looked like weakness, every hesitation sounded like failure. Baratieri knew the Ethiopian army was massive. He knew the terrain was dangerous. He knew his supply lines were thin, yet he also knew that returning without triumph could ruin him. By early 1896, the two armies faced each other near the northern town of Adwa beneath rugged hills and broken ridges. The land itself seemed built for ambush and confusion. Maps were poor, paths twisted, peaks blocked sight, valleys swallowed sound. For an army that knew the terrain, Adwa was a fortress without walls. For an army marching in darkness, it was a maze. On the night before battle, Baratieri ordered his forces forward in separate columns. The plan required timing, coordination, and accurate knowledge of the ground. It had none of these. Italian brigades moved through the blackness, each believing the others were where they were supposed to be. Units drifted apart. Officers misread positions. Distances stretched. The columns became isolated fingers reaching into the mountains. Before dawn on March 1st, 1896, the trap began to close, though no single Ethiopian commander had planned every detail like a drawing on a table. It was terrain, numbers, instinct, and command acting together. Ethiopian scouts saw the Italian movement. Menelik's forces responded with astonishing speed. What the Italians thought was a controlled advance became a desperate struggle to understand where they were and where the enemy stood. Then the highlands erupted. Ethiopian warriors poured across the slopes in waves, not as a disorganized mob, but as armies under commanders who knew their men and their ground. Ras Alula, Ras Makonnen, Ras Mikael, Ras Mengesha, and others brought their forces into the fight. Empress Taytu's troops guarded key positions and helped control the flow of battle. Menelik directed the larger storm, feeding strength where the Italians were weakest. The Italian left was struck hard. Units tried to form lines, fire volleys, and hold ridges, but the pressure kept growing. Ethiopian riflemen answered them shot for shot. This was not the fantasy Europe told itself of spears rushing helplessly into modern fire. Ethiopia had spent years buying weapons from wherever it could, playing foreign powers against one another, turning trade into survival. Many Ethiopian soldiers carried modern rifles, and they knew how to use them. Italian artillery fired into the smoke and dust. Officers shouted for order. Bugles called across terrain that twisted every sound. Men who had marched with imperial certainty now looked left and right and saw gaps where allies should have been. A brigade that expected support found itself alone. A ridge that seemed secure became surrounded. A retreat route became a killing ground. The battle became a series of collapses. One Italian formation after another was overwhelmed, not by a single blow, but by relentless pressure from every direction. Ethiopian forces climbed, flanked, surrounded, and attacked again. Where the Italians tried to regroup, they found more Ethiopians waiting. Where they tried to retreat, the land itself resisted them. General Albertoni's brigade, composed largely of Eritrean Askari fighting under Italian command, was cut off and crushed. Other brigades tried to assist and instead exposed themselves. General Dabormida's men were driven into a valley and destroyed. Confusion spread faster than orders could repair it. Baratieri's army had entered Adwa as an instrument of empire. By midday, it was a broken machine. The scale of the defeat was stunning. Thousands of Italian soldiers were killed. Thousands more were captured. Officers fell. Flags were taken. Artillery was lost. The survivors stumbled back through the mountains carrying news that Europe struggled to believe. An African empire had annihilated a European army in open battle. For Italy, Adwa was humiliation. It was not a minor setback on a distant frontier. It was a national shock. The government in Rome collapsed under the weight of the disaster. The dream of easy conquest shattered in public. Newspapers that had demanded glory now printed grief and rage. The myth of inevitable European victory had been wounded in front of the world. For Ethiopia, Adwa was more than survival. It was proof. Menelik had not merely defended his throne, he had defended his country's place among nations. After the battle, Italy was forced to recognize Ethiopia's independence. At a time when almost all of Africa was being pulled under colonial rule, Ethiopia remained sovereign, but Adwa's power reached beyond treaties. It traveled in whispers, newspapers, speeches, and memory. Across Africa and the African diaspora, it became a symbol that empire could bleed. It told colonized people that European armies were not invincible, that modern weapons did not belong to one race, and that unity could transform the expected victim into the victor. The victory was not simple legend. Ethiopia had its own internal rivalries, harsh politics, and contradictions. Menelik was an emperor, not a saint. His empire had been built through conquest as well as diplomacy, but history does not require perfect heroes to recognize a turning point. At Adwa, a state marked for domination refused the role assigned to it, gathered its strength, and forced an empire to retreat. That is why Adwa still matters, not because it was the only African resistance to colonialism, and not because it ended imperial violence. It did neither, but it broke the script at a moment when the script seemed unstoppable. It showed that the age of empire was not a machine moving without resistance. It showed that geography, leadership, preparation, and unity could humiliate arrogance. Imagine the Italian officers before dawn, marching through unfamiliar darkness, believing they were bringing history forward. Imagine the Ethiopian commanders watching the movement from the heights, knowing the mountains were with them. Imagine the first rifle shots cracking across the ridges, the first panic in the columns, the first realization that the empire had walked into a country that was ready. By sunset, the battlefield belonged to Ethiopia. The dead lay among the stones. The captured guns were silent. The flags of a European army had fallen into African hands. And in the highlands, under a sky that had watched empires rise and vanish for centuries, Ethiopia remained unconquered. Adwa was not just a battle, it was a warning carved into the age of colonialism. The smaller power is not always weaker, the underestimated enemy is not always afraid, and the nation marked for conquest may become the nation that writes the conqueror's shame into history. If history like this is what you're here for, subscribe to the Human Conflict Library. There's a lot more coming.